Okay, so I want to talk about the recent interview for Channel 4 News with Jordan Peterson and Cathy Newman. If you haven't seen it, I think probably most of you will have done. If you haven't seen it, go and have a watch. Really, really interesting. Interesting because of the subject matter, interesting because of the arguments, but also interesting because it's interesting. It's just an interesting example of a journalist, and that's kind of journalistic way of looking at things and style and way of interacting. And it's impossible to know with Cathy Newman how much of what she was saying was her opinions and how much of it was her just playing a sort of devil's advocate and asking the kinds of challenging questions that you have to ask as a journalist. But contrasting that with Jordan Peterson and the approach that he was having to answering those questions and the kind of friction between the two things. I've seen a lot of people have responded to this, and I know it's the nature of YouTube, which is that something happens, you watch 10 videos by 10 different people making the same arguments in 10 different accents. I've undoubtedly got a different accent to probably the other 9 that you've seen on this subject, especially because I had a few too many alcoholic beverages and had to raise my voice above the background level a few too many times last night, so I'm a little bit more gravelly than usual, which is either a good thing and I'm sounding husky and sexy, or it's irritating the shit out of you. I apologise if it's the latter, and I'm maybe somewhat concerned in many cases if it's the former. But go and have a watch if you hadn't had a watch. The point that most people have picked up, there's 2 points that I want to make on it, but the point that most people picked up on was this thing about so what you're saying. That's what she kept saying. So what you're saying, and she did this again and again and again with Peterson, and people were kind of annoyed by that because she was misread. He would say something, and seemingly 99% of people who watched that video could understand what he was saying, even if they didn't agree with him. And her response would really badly mangle and misportray what he was saying. And so he was laughing several times at some of the responses he got. That wasn't the thing that I wanted to talk about, though. Largely because there's no point me just going over the same old ground as everybody else. But also because that wasn't the bit that irritated me, because that got challenged. It was the bit that wasn't challenged, which was this thing that she did a number of times, which is it's just something you see so often. And it's again, talking like the quote mines in the last video I made, it's something else that confounds so many discussions that we have, is that we start from a statistical argument. And then, so when a statistical, when the thing on discussion is statistical, so she would bring something up which is a statistical bone of contention, right? About society and about men versus women, and he would give a response in kind, a statistical argument about proportions of men and women and how they think and what they prefer and what they go into, and then she would just ignore all of that and say, but there are some women that want to do that, right? As if that was a fucking retort, as if that makes any sense whatsoever. And his response would just be, yeah, I didn't say there wasn't, which is fine, but it was almost as if he couldn't even be asked to explain to her this is where this conversation's going wrong. But that was absolutely where that conversation was going wrong. She'd say something that talked about the pay gap, and the fact it's 9%, the gender pay gap for full-time workers, for hourly rate of pay in the United Kingdom, which is a correct statistic she gave, and so median pay as well, because there was a little bit of a problem where they started talking about high earners skewing it. Actually, the high earners don't skew it because it's a median rate of pay, not a mean rate of pay. So that was wrong. But she talked about that and asked him, explain this 9%, this has got to be due to sexism. And he effectively said, well, some of it might be, but there are these other factors that I don't think are. And he brought these factors up. They discussed these factors. And so she was asking a statistical thing. When you take all the men and all the women in the United Kingdom, this is that are working full time, this is the difference you get. So he started giving a statistical answer that men gravitate more to this and that. Men on average are more prepared to maybe negotiate harder for pay, and more prepared to make the gross sacrifices, or there are more men ready to make the gross sacrifices that one has to make to one's personal and family life to be a director of a FTSE 100 company. It's certainly not the kind of sacrifice that I'd be prepared to make in a million fucking years, but there were more men prepared to make it than women, and her response would be, But there are some women prepared to make those sacrifices as well, which is like there's no level of ignorance worse than that, is there? And I couldn't decipher whether she was doing that just because that was the only response she could think of, or whether she legitimately thought that that was a reasonable response. But I know there are people who will make that response. Effectively, if you said that men on average are taller than women, they'd say to you, "Well, I know a woman that's 6'2". You know, I mean, that's as if that fucking falsifies what you said. So that was the bit that irritated me there. The other thing that's concerned me more since that. Go and watch it. Decide what you think to yourself if you haven't for yourself for that. But following on from that, I googled it. Okay, I looked at the news articles, and what disappointed me yesterday was that almost every news article I came across wasn't talking about what they talked about. It was talking about the fact, all the online abuse that Cathy Newman has received since, and the fact that Channel 4 have been consulting a security expert and looking at increasing her security detail as a result of this interview, which the latter half of that might be a little bit over the top, as Jordan Peterson, he has come out and said, look, back off. If you're calling her a bitch on social media and all manner of other things, right, back off. There's no need for that. But he said, on the other hand, I can't find any actual threats. So whether that bit's a little bit of hyperbole. But this is the thing. I just can't get my head around it. I know this happens, right? I know this happens on social media, but I just can't get my head around it, especially in this circumstance when she did so poorly and he did so well, right? I mean, that it wouldn't say it was justified in any other circumstance, but imagine this. Imagine I go out now and my neighbour is walking past my car and accidentally puts a scratch down the side, right? And I punch him in the face, which wouldn't be justified, and I wouldn't do it anyway because he's a fucking policeman, so it would be a particularly poor move to make. But it wouldn't be justified, but you could at least see the link. This guy has scratched your car, accidentally perhaps, but he scratched your car, you punched him in the face. But imagine now I go out and he doesn't scratch my car, and I punch him in the face because he hasn't scratched my car. That doesn't make one iota. It doesn't make, the slightest bit of sense. And this is what has happened here. So if Cathy Newman had torn Jordan Peterson to intellectual shreds, then maybe you could understand the sort of bitterness from some of his supporters who are also trolls, that would feel the need to then go and attack her and call her a bitch and a slut on social media. Maybe you could sort of see that. It wouldn't be the right thing to do, but you could at least see it. But when he's done so well, and the tragedy is that it ends up becoming a Sarkeesian, right? You end up turning it into a Sarkeesian, by which I mean Anita Sarkeesian largely made her fame not out of her critiques of video games, but of the threats she received on the back of it. And it added these awful fucking critiques she made gained legitimacy on the back of the threats, because that became, people had sympathy. Oh my God, she's received threats. There must be something in what she's saying because she's receiving threats. And so it distracts from the arguments, and you actually empower the person that you're actually antagonistic to, and that's exactly what will happen here. This should have, what you would want, especially if you're on Jordan Peterson's side, I mean, you side with his views rather than Cathy Newman's, you should want everybody to be discussing what was said, not discussing the fact that poor Cathy Newman's received a lot. I just don't understand the motivation for somebody. What do you think that you're helping? Jordan's done his bit, right? Now I'll do my bit by going and calling her a fucking bitch on Twitter, right? No, you've not done your bit. All you've actually just fucked things up. That's what you've done there, right? You've just played it. What you are effectively is a Cathy Newman. Ironically, you're a Cathy Newman supporter in many ways. If that's what you do, you may as fucking well be. If that is what you do. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. I think I probably ought to give my voice a little bit of a rest now. Okay, thank you for watching. Bye for now.